several people asked me if I would attend today.
Well, we're no cells out, so I'm looking moving around. YouTube is up.
YouTube's up. Both cameras are going. This is ready to go. Audio's coming in through the mics. We're good to go.
Okay.
You want to start? I have to have has his widow arrived.
She has not.
Okay, we'll wait.
We're basically waiting on Linda.
That's fine. You may want to tell, since most of these people are not from here, where the restrooms are and that kind
That
of
would
thing.
be a good thing to announce at this time. That's right.
Don't forget,
No.
and don't forget to tell them that when you stand up.
Okay.
My group on the way here was worried about that sort of thing.
While we're waiting to gather, I'll tell you where the restrooms are. Go out the door you came in, turn left down the hall, and there's a hall to your right. And there are the restrooms. We'll be here for a while, so I thought you needed to know. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Thanks. That's our next recognize her. I can.
Oh, yeah. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for your patience, and we're grateful everyone has arrived safe and sound. I'm Erica Engstrom, Director of the School of Journalism and Media here at the University of Kentucky. We gather today to remember David Hawpe, University of Kentucky journalism graduate, editor of the student newspaper, the Kentucky Colonel, editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal, and defender of the First Amendment. The tradition of excellence that marks the School of Journalism and Media and its programs in news reporting and media arts and studies shows us how great this university is in training the journalists of today and tomorrow. We produce outstanding media professionals at the local, state, national, and international levels. And David Hawpe serves as an exemplar of that tradition that continues today. We are currently ranked in the top 10 of schools ranked by the Hearst Journalism Awards among 104 accredited journalism and media programs across the United States. When we first learned of David's passing, our faculty wanted to honor him. Professor Al Cross suggested this symposium where people who knew and worked with David could share their insights and experiences regarding how he saw the press and its importance as the protector of those without power, from those who hold it or those who refuse to use it to advance the common good. This event is the result of the hard work of Professor Cross and School of Journalism and Media staff members John Cruz and Chris Larmour. We are streaming live on YouTube and welcome those online who are joining us today, which coincidentally is Constitution Day, the anniversary of the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. To begin the David Hawpe Symposium, I now turn it over to Professor Al Cross, our organizer and moderator for today.
Great. Thank you, Erica. Good afternoon. We are here to pay tribute to David Hawpe, one of Kentucky's most accomplished journalists and a national leader of our craft, who chose to spend his life in Kentucky in service of his people. Many in this room, including me, count themselves lucky to have worked with and for David and to have known him as a friend. We have assembled a group of speakers who knew David from several perspectives because there were so many facets to his life in journalism. Here at UK, covering coal, loving politics, fighting for open government, pushing the newspaper industry to get real about diversity, and providing leadership to all of Kentucky's newspapers. We'll close with a roundtable discussion about the future of journalism and how David's career might inform and guide that. That's what makes this a symposium. Before we get started, please welcome David's wife of 55 years, Linda Hawpe. And is Chris with you, or is he parking? Okay, Chris, thank you. I would also introduce Dr. Jennifer Greer, Dean of the College of Communication and Information. And a shout out to my friend Tom Loftus, budding artist who produced our cover art. Tom, take a bow. We are especially pleased to have with us today the president of the University of Kentucky, Dr. Eli Capilouto. Since he came to our campus from his native Alabama just over 10 years ago, he has been an irresistible force, and the university is much better for it. It's now a $5 billion enterprise that has leveraged private money to transform itself while still serving students and the land-grant mission that is essential to the state. From 2013 to 2019, David Hawpe was one of the president's supervisors as a trustee of the university. And during that time, I sometimes pondered the conversations they might be having. Now the president has a chance to tell us what it was like to have David Hawpe as a boss and advisor. Welcome, Dr. Eli Capilouto.
Thank you, Al. Good afternoon, and let me add my welcome to the University of Kentucky. As many of you know, this university occupied a special place in David Hawpe's mind and heart. Space shared with a handful of coveted institutions and communities, among them the Commonwealth, the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the South Louisville neighborhood where he was raised, the halls of Frankfort, the Courier-Journal, and of course, all the other towns and cities, hamlets, and hollers that he claimed somehow as his birthright. But UK was part of David's identity, his passion, his sense of advocacy, and his belief in certain elemental institutions and communities central to advising our state. I did not have as long an association with David as many of you in this room, and I regret that, for I grew to have immense respect and an abiding, deep sense of affection for David Hawpe. I will always carry him within me. I knew beneath the occasional bit of bluster, or at times sharp word of disagreement, although he was never disagreeable with me, there was an unreserved love for this place and what he saw as its essential role in Kentucky's future. I learned he was a trustee on a warm summer afternoon, didn't know him well or at all, really, and was immediately told by some of my staff, well, this is going to be interesting. Indeed it was. I read vivid descriptions of David recently, and they perfectly match my recollection. Ties that looked like they came from a Jackson Pollock exhibit. I looked for my most colorful one today because of him. The suspenders, the color rimmed glasses, matched only in exuberance by his loud and resonant voice and his infectious laugh and his insatiable curiosity and interest in conversation and, how shall we say it, love of debate. I do remember the first time I met with him alone and in person. It was at Maxwell Place in front of the fireplace, the one that works there. And David had taken it upon himself to learn about my family's history. Both sides of my family had immigrated from an island. He knew the history of that island. He knew that those who didn't leave, as my grandparents did in the early 1900s, how they were trapped there and killed by the Nazis. He knew the whole story. He's probably the first and only person that's asked me about all that in my 10 years at Kentucky. He took such a personal interest. But then at one of his first meetings as trustee, David took on what he did in every meeting as a trustee. So the board was discussing ideas and proposals around the complete rebuilding of our residence halls, a process that was being expedited and facilitated by a public-private partnership. The newspaper down the street from us charitably it might be said, was ambivalent, quite dubious at best, about the business partnership and the architectural and design integrity of these projects. So David launched. As usual, I would shift uneasily in my chair. But by the time he castigated what he deemed the brutalist assault, he was referring to the Patterson office tower, that he believed was designed by the person he blamed for the old residence halls, he was right about a couple of them. I really realized that he was, in full-throated fashion, supporting our proposal. Such was one of my early introductions to David Hawpe. Candid and unfiltered, deeply knowledgeable on a broad expanse of topics, and supportive when he thought we were right. And when he believed that we needed to be held accountable, he let us know his opposition, and he was willing to tell us directly why. I suspect you would agree with me that there is an unbroken and sturdy through line from David as crusading student journalist at UK to editor, to editorial writer, and national leader in his field, to trustee both at Morehead State University and the University of Kentucky. As a trustee, I believe that David brought to bear three things that made an indelible impact on us. The first, he brought to his work as a trustee his orientation as a journalist. He interrogated issues before us, peppering us with questions, not out of opposition, but wanting to make clear to himself and fellow trustees what we were considering, and often what were the real stakes in the issue. I also think he understood that issues became stories, and stories were narratives. And narratives are how we, as people and constituents, understand and explain to ourselves and each other complex policies and problems. He understood relationships in the way that a reporter understands the importance of sources. From his days as an intrepid reporter at the Kentucky Colonel, he uncovered the scandal in the football program, relying in part, I'm told, on sources he developed as a high school student in Louisville. He sincerely cultivated relationships because he liked people. It was that simple and beautiful. I also think he was an early witness to power and an early convert to the idea that you can and should speak truth to it. But he also understood that relationships are how things get done. He quickly became fast friends with several board members and leaders who he allied himself with as they were like-minded on a number of issues. He even brought some of those folks who were not like-minded into the fold. And I'm told that after our board meetings, they shared more than a few glasses of wine. Second in the indelible mark, the zeal of an advocate and the skill of a politician. He believed that higher education had to play a more essential and powerful role in the development and advancement of the state of Kentucky. He loved Kentucky, but that did not mean he didn't see its complexity, its beauty, and its deep industriousness and pride of its people, alongside the historic antipathy to some quarters to education and to an aversion to change. But he understood all these tensions, and he believed that education was critical in reconciling them. As a result, he worked both inside and outside the hallways and corridors of power to advocate, push, and cajole on higher education's behalf. That meant he also questioned its leaders, criticizing more than one president, including one that's with you today, when he thought we didn't push hard enough to elevate higher education within the state's public discourse. Third and finally, he believed in his alma mater, the University of Kentucky. He believed that we had a particular and special role to play. It is no secret that he lobbied Governor Patton for higher education reform, including something that I think transformed this university and Commonwealth, the Bucks for Brains program, as a seminal initiative. He believed stellar faculty improved the brand and reputation of a university. I remember one of our last communications, I wrote him a note sending him a copy of Tracy Campbell's book, 1942, A Year of Peril. Because David used to pound on me at every board meeting about the criticality of scholars. And I was so proud of that book, I knew, at least I thought, that in some ways we would meet David's high standards when I sent it to him. And that note he sent in reply is one I cherish. He knew that the brand and reputation of a university led to more students, bright minds full of potential and promise, who would be transformed by their experiences and would in turn transform a state. He believed that Kentucky was no less deserving of a world-class public research university than any state in the country, and he would be its strongest advocate. He believed our children were no less deserving of an education. And he believed, as did my predecessor, that such a university was inextricably linked to a state that was healthier, wealthier, and wiser. He was unrelenting in his advocacy of that vision and unwilling to compromise on it. It suffused everything he did on our board and why he was so appropriately on the committee that determined and oversaw academic and student affairs. It was the development of a student that was in his core, a student empowered, emboldened, and enabled by a faculty member that stirred his soul and enlivened his passions. I suspect he saw a young man or woman from Appalachia or Louisville's West End, and in his mind's eye, remembered what education did for him. It awakened his mind and his intellect to possibility. And he wanted the same for all of Kentucky's sons and daughters. Those passions were so large, and it was essential, I think, that they were given voice by someone who seemed so much larger than life, and that was David V. Hawpe. At his passing, I noted to the Courier-Journal that David loved Kentucky, every coal town and community, and all the contours and contradictions of its history. He believed deeply that journalism and education were essential to advancing Kentucky's future. His life was uncompromisingly dedicated to a place in its people, and he always believed in them both. As a trustee, as he was as a journalist, he channeled that love by challenging us to do more, to be more. He asked hard questions. He expected good answers. He held us to high standards because he expected his alma mater to fulfill its promise. And it was so important in helping Kentucky to fulfill its promise to its people. He was a journalist and a trustee. Ultimately, defined and driven by the place he loved. I will miss him. We will miss him. So does Kentucky. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Capilouto. I appreciate the mention of Bucks for Brains because that helps support the Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues, which I run. When some of us former Courier Journal folks and a few others gathered soon after David's passing, the only person to deliver remarks at that event was our next speaker. As Steve Ford spoke to that small group, I started envisioning this event with him as the closest thing we have to a keynoter today other than the president. Their careers at the Courier Journal were intertwined for decades, and there is no better person to give us the great overview of David's career before we start digging into the details. So please welcome, who I think was the best managing editor Louisville ever had, Stephen J. Ford. And Steve, you can speak from your seat if you would like. Okay, very good.
Thanks, Alan. Good afternoon. Before I say anything, I want to express my appreciation, and I'm certain without even asking that I speak for the other panelists in the audience, to President Capilouto, the University of Kentucky, and the School of Journalism and Media for arranging this program to honor David Hawpe and to explore some of the issues he cared about so deeply. And particularly, I want to direct gratitude to my longtime colleague and friend Al Cross, as peripatetic and indefatigable as ever. His diligence was pivotal in making today's events happen. When David retired from the Courier Journal in 2009, I said during a send-off at the newspaper that his was arguably the most consequential journalistic career in Kentucky since Henry Watterson. Well, I recognize there might be one or two other nominees for that distinction. I don't think there can be any argument about his outsized role for almost 4 decades in shaping news coverage, editorial commentary, and the nature and direction of our profession in Kentucky and sometimes beyond. To appreciate the range of David's passions and contributions, just look at the areas that are reflected on the panel: education, coal, politics, media law, diversity, the news business. And even then, we're being selective. We could have added governance, poverty, social and racial justice, internationalism, and a host of other subjects. Here in Kentucky, we overdo horse racing metaphors, that's true, but nonetheless, it is indeed the case that David broke fast from the gate in pursuing journalism. In fact, he became the editor of his first paper while attending Charles Jacob Elementary School. For reasons David insisted he never understood, the editor's position came automatically with appointment as captain of the school's safety patrol. David seized the opportunity to write his first editorial, which castigated those who put bubble gum in the drinking fountains. Editorials would follow for years on greater subjects. The intense desire to shine a light on scofflaws was undiminished. David proceeded to serve as editor of the papers at Southern Junior High and Male High. While at Male, where his editorials included a campaign against bullying, David was picked to participate in a prestigious national high school journalism program at Northwestern University. And as an aside, incidentally, he also was runner-up as a senior for the Judge Robert Worth Bingham Gold Medal for Oratory. David losing an oratory contest? That hardly seems possible. I teased David a couple of times that the kid who won probably didn't give a better speech. It was just shorter. In any event, by the time David arrived at UK in 1961, he was already a seasoned editor of 3 school newspapers. You'll hear more about David at UK from our longtime colleague and mutual friend Richard Wilson, so I'm going to fast forward to the summer of 1969. David had landed a job in Florida as an editorial writer for the St. Petersburg Times. George Gill, then the managing editor of the Courier Journal, had written about the space program and took advantage of his position to assign himself to cover the launch of Apollo 11, the mission that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. David was also on hand, assigned to write a poem for the Times Sunday magazine. Gill was looking for someone to take over the CJ's Eastern Kentucky Bureau in Hazard, from which veteran correspondent Kyle Vance was about to decamp. George was intrigued by David's family background and his familiarity with the mountains. They talked, a job offer followed, and by that fall, David, his wife Linda, and their young son Chris were in Hazard. A second son, Jonathan, came along a few years later in Louisville. In eastern Kentucky, after more than a year of writing largely about the ravages of strip mining and the promise and frustrations of war on poverty programs, what I have always viewed as the seminal event in David's career occurred. On December 30th, 1970, shafts 15 and 16 exploded with terrifying force at the Finley Coal Company on Hurricane Creek in Leslie County. 38 of the 39 miners who were underground at the time were killed. David was the CJ's lead reporter on the story, and an assignment complicated by heavy snow that fell in the mountains on the night of the tragedy. What followed constituted a full tapestry of an Appalachian mine disaster. The blast came with such violent force that it blackened some of the mountainside on the opposite side of the hollow from the mine portals. The bodies of the dead miners were laid out on the floor of an elementary school gymnasium in Hyden. Some were so mutilated they could be identified only by the Social Security numbers etched into their belts. It was quickly established that blasting in the mine involved use of primacord, an impermissible explosive in underground coal mines. A voluminous pile of evidence was amassed, showing a history of blasting and coal dust violations in the Finley mine, as well as a sorry record of feckless federal and state enforcement of mine safety laws and regulations. Such was the impact of the experience that David became determined someday to state as fact, not opinion, that coal is an outlaw industry. That opportunity came a little more than a decade later. Following explosions and multiple deaths in mines at Topmost in Knott County in December 1981 and at Craner in Floyd County the following month, the Courier-Journal launched an exhaustive investigation into mine safety, published as a series entitled Dying for Coal. When the newspaper later made the entire 9-day series available in a special section, David, by now managing editor and a newsroom leader, wrote an introduction for the reprint. His first sentence, "Coal is an outlaw industry." David believed passionately in, quote, journalism that makes a difference, end quote, not only by exposing problems and wrongdoing, but also by offering remedies, and indeed often by comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. He did not believe that true objectivity is possible in journalism the way it is in chemistry. But that was not meant to be an acceptance of lazy, shoddy, and incomplete reporting. Instead, he felt the best coverage was motivated by a desire to offer a deep understanding of issues, context, consequences, and potential resolution, and not bland neutrality that fails to distinguish what's important from what's not and to determine what's true and what's false. But he always believed that reporting must be pursued with balance and with rigor and open-minded inquiry. He encouraged this in ways large and small, sometimes with grim determination and other times with a lighter hand. Occasionally, for example, David would respond to a snafu by erupting in a daily news conference, "Bring me the miscreant." The miscreant, by the way, had little to fear unless the offense was truly severe. David was no disciplinarian. On another occasion, he urged the staff to watch the TV sitcom Roseanne in the belief that it would make them less elitist. And David would chafe at the tendency of photographers and feature writers to rush to Cherokee Park, near to where many of them lived, to capture those familiar glimpses of children playing in the snow. Cherokee Park, as most of you know, is in Louisville's relatively affluent East End, and David, ever the polemicist, tended to view these youngsters tenderly. David loved children, but nonetheless as the offspring of the oppressor class. He wanted to see more weather stories from Iroquois and Shawnee parks in the generally working class neighborhoods of the South End and the West End. So he would march out of his office into the newsroom and proclaim, "Snow is falling. Children are sledding in Iroquois Park." But while there were these and many other lighter moments, journalism is a serious business, and David was a serious journalist. His leadership was tested often by serious challenges, and he often found himself battling strong currents as he tried to do what he knew was the right thing. At a time when some of his superiors wanted the newspaper's reporting staff to be withdrawn into the Louisville market, David expanded regional coverage in Kentucky and Indiana and supported a vigorous Washington bureau. At a time when even David acknowledged in a memo to the staff that resources were tight, he dispatched reporter Joel Brinkley and photographer Jay Mather to Thailand to help our readers understand the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in refugee camps by reporting on relief efforts by people from our area. The CJ got more than that. It ended up providing a detailed and early look at the killing fields in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, and the newspaper won a Pulitzer in, of all things, international reporting. At a time of ownership and upper management condescension towards sports, often in the mistaken belief that emphasis on sports would detract from coverage of the arts, David understood the importance of sports to a vast number of our readers. Sports coverage improved, and so did coverage of the arts. At a time when there was much talk, but too little action about diversity in newsrooms and news coverage, David was determined to hire and promote more journalists of color in our own shop to provide broader and deeper coverage of the issues in minority communities and to increase opportunities in Kentucky and elsewhere for aspiring minority journalists to gain the education and training they needed to succeed. More on that later. At a time of ownership pressure to reduce news and editorial legal expenses, David worked with our attorneys repeatedly to open official records and meetings. More about that, too, later in the program. And in the process, there was so much work that did indeed make a difference. Education reform, nursing home reform, corrupt political officials marched out of office, new insights into the black experience in Louisville, Pulitzer-winning coverage and follow-up to the fatal church bus crash near Carrollton, a report card on anti-poverty programs, exposés that led to the state's adoption of an auto title law, and in-depth coverage of the flaws that doomed the Marble Hill nuclear plant, and more education reform. I'll end my list of David's accomplishments with what I think was his most important contribution as an editorialist, and President Capelouto has already referred to it, and that would be Kentucky's landmark Bucks for Brains undertaking. If they were here, David and former Governor Paul Patton might disagree on who actually thought of it. But whether the original idea was David's or whether he simply kept everyone's feet to the fire to get it done isn't particularly important. David had become convinced that without dramatic new initiatives and investment, Kentucky higher education was doomed to underperformance and often to mediocrity. He had seen firsthand in the mid-1970s, during a year at Harvard as a Nieman Fellow, what resources could mean to a university. And in Patton, David found a fellow believer and a partner to create the public-private partnerships that has raised hundreds of millions of dollars for Kentucky public higher education. The results were dramatic. Bucks for Brains increased endowments, created professorships and endowed chairs, attracted talented graduate students, enticed academic stars to relocate to Kentucky campuses, and not incidentally to the political leadership, created jobs. Like everything else in this state, the program has been hit by recent revenue shortages, and there is certainly much more to be done, but the benefits have been enormous. Even in retirement, of course, David did not go gently into the night. He served as an unpaid legislative aide to State Senator Morgan McGarvey. He worked with Jane Ncaa, the National Council of Jewish Women, and local officials to create the Jefferson County Family Recovery Court. He worked with the American Lung Association and others to raise money for research and treatment regarding asthma and lung disease. And he served as a regent at Moorhead State University and in his dream job as a trustee here at UK. At the risk of sounding glib, I doubt even death will truly stifle David. There are too many people still in journalism and in public life who were deeply influenced by him for that to happen, and too much of the good that he inspired lives on. It's a fool's errand, I suppose, to try and have a closing thought about David. So I'll defer instead to Shakespeare, who did always seem to know what to say. I think of Antony's final tribute in Julius Caesar as he praises Brutus for his general honest thought and common good to all. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man.
Thank you very much, Steve. Other than Linda Hawpe, perhaps no one in this room knew David longer than Richard Wilson. They were colleagues at the Kernel, then for decades at the Courier-Journal, and after Dick retired, he came back to the campus as interim director of the School of Journalism. I suspect David might have had something to do with that, I'm not certain. Dick is here to talk about David as a journalism student and as a professional colleague. Please welcome Richard Wilson.
My role here is to subtract a number of years from the parts of David's life primarily described by President Capilouto and Steve. I think it's fitting that this event is being held here on the UK campus because this is where David put his whole package together, where he assembled the foundation that made him the kind of journalist he became and enabled him to rise to the top editorial levels of the Courier-Journal and beyond. When he came here, David was a brash young man. I think Jack Guthrie, who was editor at the time David and I worked together, would agree that he also had a certain amount of insecurity. He had not gotten into the fraternity he wanted in badly. And he followed another person on the colonel's staff who knew that he would be editor and not David in a couple of years. And David, I think, knew that too. But there were benefits in David's insecurity. And it didn't last all that long either. It forced him to work harder. He was like many college students at that time. He was trying to find his lane. And he did. He found it on the Colonel. We met in the fall of 1962. David was a young sports writer, and I was managing editor of the Colonel. And there was an effort by a couple of editors to remove David from the UK football beat. There was a feeling that he didn't have the experience to cover what some feared might be a coming controversy in the hiring of a new coach. How right they were. And I must say that I intervened on David's behalf to keep him on the beat. And I'm glad I did. It was never a bad mood. David wrote better as a sophomore and was more cerebral than most other Colonel students at that point in their career. He did have strong opinions, and I'm sure it wouldn't amaze many people here that he was eager to express them. But that was a pretty good trait for a future editorial writer and columnist. The football controversy unraveled in the second semester of that year. It surrounded the techniques of the new football coach, Charlie Bradshaw, who came from the University of Alabama, and the way he handled spring practice. Bradshaw brought to UK the successful methods of his mentor, Paul Bear Bryant, at the University of Alabama. Bryant had been the basketball coach, or football coach, at UK during its football heyday of the late 1940s and early 50s. And Bradshaw was one of his players. But he followed Bradshaw to Texas A&M University, followed Bryant to Texas A&M University, and on to Alabama. And with that much experience, Charlie thought the same kind of discipline would be successful here at UK in his own first head coaching position. Well, the end result was that 50-some of the 83 players on the football team quit. It didn't bother Charlie. He said, they were deadwood, they were quitters. Well, David had 5 friends from Male High School on the team. I don't recall if all 5 of them left the UK football team, but they all talked to David. And it wasn't long before David was breaking off exclusive and good stories about what was happening there. I don't have time, because of the time restrictions assigned by Mr. Cross, to go into great detail on this, but it suffices to say that it didn't take long for David to be running with the big dogs of the Louisville and Lexington media. David's interests in sports broadened significantly, and here's an example of one column that he wrote on the overemphasis of athletics at UK and other colleges and universities. He began by blaming the alumni, quote, who had a few deep pockets and came up with chemistry labs and classrooms. And then he went to the other culprits he decided on, students, administration, faculty, athletes, and citizens of states who identified with the teams. There are plenty of others like this, which time prohibits going into, but I do want to cite 2 other examples of vintage Hawpe. In 1964, the UK football team upset Mississippi, which was ranked number 1. As a result of that game, UK moved up to number 5 in the national rankings. And you can imagine the happiness that everyone in Lexington at UK and UK supporters around the state. But leave it to David to throw out a cautionary note. In a Kernel editorial, he wrote, "We feel that something is very wrong in a system of values which leads thousands of students and fans to greet the football team at the airport, while quieter but vastly more significant educationals remain largely unsung." One other one, and I was there to see this happen. During the 1964-65 academic year, UK was celebrating its centennial. The high point of the centennial was Founders Day. And the keynote speaker was the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. I was there because I had returned to the campus to finish my degree, and my job was communications director for the centennial. President Johnson came into Memorial Coliseum. He donned his robe. At the time, President Oswald was recognizing the first distinguished alumni of the university. He buttoned his robe, marched on the stage, almost literally pushed President Oswald aside and began his own remarks. David didn't think that that was quite appropriate, even for a president of the United States. And this was really the best example I could think of David being the proverbial skunk at the garden party. If you want to know about David's ability to analyze things, and you may not agree with this, this is the one I found. David said that the President of the United States was out of his proper rights to mess up the event as such. He added, "This centennial has appeared like so many threads, knotted together with loose ends everywhere. Instead of the Founders Day convocation was devoted to the dull, platitudinous incantation of the great wizard of politics. Unfortunately, his remarks were not relevant to the centennial. And besides, we had heard them all before. We suspect that the administration was playing its own name game in inviting the president to speak on Founders Day. Unfortunately, we found ourselves asking, what's in a name, and realizing that the answer wasn't much. Another good description of David at that time is in a book called The Thin 30 by Shane Ragland. And it's a book primarily about the first year of Coach Bradshaw's tenure here. And David is featured in parts of the book. And here's what Ragland said about him. Arriving in Lexington, if Hawpe had any fear of yielding the pen, it didn't show. While he might be the geek that the lovely sorority girls would ignore and the fraternity boys might taunt, they still had to pick up his Kentucky Colonel 5 days a week and read what he'd wrote. Hawpe liked the power, knowing when he wrote provocatively, and he liked to do that. People were reading and thinking about what he said, even if they were infuriated. a quiet sort of arrogance, almost a pomposity, surrounded Hawpe and his endeavors. He had an unshakable sense of what was right, that what he thought was correct, and an equally firm determination to write about what he thought. Journalism for Hawpe was about discovery and shedding light on dark corners. Let me just end by saying, I think that anyone who worked with David and who read what he wrote over the years has to be glad that he decided to spend the majority of his career here in Kentucky. I'm thankful, certainly for one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick. That rings so true. David Hawpe left Appalachia when he was 4 years old, but it never left him. And he went back, and his first job at the Courier-Journal was at the Hazard Bureau, where a primary topic was coal. And that is our next subject. Thanks to Linda for providing some of these pictures. Before I introduce our next two speakers, this seems like the best time to announce that the Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues and the College of Communication and Information have created a David Hawpe Fund. Our plan is to use it to fund reporting and research by our students in Appalachia. I want to thank Eleanor Bingham Miller, who provided the seed money with a gift to the Institute in honor of David and the late Al Smith, who was my early mentor and the co-founder of the Institute. If you're interested in this effort, please tell me, Erica Engstrom, Jennifer Greer, or our College Development Officer, Nathan Darcy, who I believe is with us. Nathan, right there. To talk about David Hawpe and coal, we are glad to have with us Mimi Pickering and, by video, Steve Kaywood. Steve is a retired attorney in Pineville, where he grew up. He was one of the first Appalachian volunteers of the Council of the Southern Mountains, then worked for CSM, helping communities seek grants, and helped start the Appalachian Research and Defense Fund of Kentucky. He was a longtime friend of David Hawpe in the Courier-Journal, and his law office was known to many of us as the Pineville Bureau. Steve can't be with us, so he'll appear by video.
David Hawpe and I had both been students at the University of Kentucky at the same time, but at that time we didn't know each other. We didn't meet
More
until
volume,
December
Chris.
30th, 1970. David at that time was staffing the Hazard Bureau of the Courier-Journal, and I was down in Barberville opening a new office for the legal services program we were creating. On December 30th, 1969, the new Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act had been signed into law, and exactly 1 year later, a massive coal dust explosion ripped through the workings of the Findlay Coal Company's Hurricane Creek Mine in Leslie County, taking the lives of 38 miners. That afternoon, before word of the disaster was made public, Congressman Carl Perkins called me down in Barberville and told me that some friends of his had called him from the Hurricane Creek area, telling him that there'd been an explosion. And he asked me if I would drive over there and find out what had occurred and then report back to him. A heavy wet snow was pouring down, but I set out. David was at that time over in Jenkins, as I recall, having a tutorial on coal mining with Dave Zagier. And when the state desk called him, they told him to head for Hyden. What occurred in the following days and weeks that I think most significant to David's career in journalism was what I think of as a unique collaboration of young lawyers and journalists working and sharing unselfishly to ferret out the cause of this tragedy that occurred. These these were a small cadre of public interest lawyers from all over the country who had worked together at a thing they call Mountain People's Rights, which was about to become the Appalachian Research and Defense Fund, and a gaggle of young journalists from papers as diverse as the Courier-Journal, the New York Times, and Whitesburg's Mountain Eagle. During the coming weeks and months, these young people worked tirelessly, talking with the sole survivor, A.T. Collins, the widows of the men who had perished, and researching mining technology and explosives, digging through thousands of pages of mine inspection reports in both Frankfurt and Washington until there finally began to emerge a simple, deadly key in the form of a detonating device produced by the DuPont company called Primacord, a tool marketed for use in surface blasting and on the battlefield. But Primacord was not a permissible device that federal mining laws allowed to be used in underground mines because when ignited it explodes, releasing fire and a substantial vibration, characteristics which inside a coal mine, an underground coal mine, cause the flotation coal dust to ignite, creating a violent explosion. What is remarkable to me is that somehow 5 or 6 otherwise ego-driven lawyers and 5 or 6 journalists, otherwise obsessed with a goal for the exclusive, unselfishly sharing the discovery of every hidden piece of the puzzle to gradually paint a picture of how what had occurred to cause this needless loss of life. Through that collaboration, David and I became lifelong friends, a friendship which lasted, these 50 years. Our home in Pineville became known among David and his cohorts as the curious as the Pineville Bureau. Much has been written about the impact of David's seeing the bodies of the 38 miners laid out in that gym in Hyden after the explosion had occurred, and his devotion thereafter to the cause of mine safety. But I would posit to you that when David joined the Courier and headed to Hazard, he took with him at that time a concern for the people of Appalachia and eastern Kentucky from his roots in Pike County, and a conviction that the press could give voice to people too often not heard in the halls of Frankfurt and Washington. David never forgot his roots. David never forgot us. David contributed reporting that helped lead to the federal strip mine law. And he also made sure that the paper bird-dogged the state regulators and the federal regulators and provided reporting that helped abolish the broad form deed in the 1988 referendum. We will all remember the 1982 Dying for Coal series that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Investigative reporters and editors said it showed that the coal industry remains an outlaw industry, rife with illegal practices and unsafe conditions that kill employees in appalling numbers. And even after he was no longer editor, David's influence kept the Hazard Bureau going for almost 10 years after he was no longer editor. I last talked with David a few weeks before he passed away, when he called me to discuss the idea of those of us still living who had worked on the Hurricane Creek issues having a reunion of sorts. David cautiously asked me if I would be willing to drive to Lexington or to Louisville, considering all but I were now scattered around the country. Little did I suspect that he might be unable to drive home to the mountains he loved. Farewell, my friend. I'm glad I got to know you.
It's remarkable how Hurricane Creek still resonates over 50 years later. This picture shows David escorting a widow out of a church. Pardon me? Mamie Pickering is the director and editor of the Buffalo Creek Flood, An Act of Man, which was selected by the Library of Congress for inclusion in the National Film Registry in 2005. She and Ann Lewis did the film Ann Braden, Southern Patriot, about a white woman from Louisville who was a legendary civil rights leader and mentor to generations of social justice activists. Mamie has been at Apple Shop in Whitesburg since the early 1970s. She is board president of the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. Please welcome Mamie Pickering.
Thank you, Al. And this is a hard acts to follow, and I hope I'm not too redundant. But I was an 18-year-old in California about to start a college internship at the West Virginia Black Lung Association when I was stunned by the news of the Hurricane Creek disaster in December of 1970. So I arrived in Charleston in January of 71, and the staff and the miners with the Black Lung Association were still grieving that disaster and really angered by it, fired up particularly by the graphic reporting that really made it clear the company's negligence in causing these miners to die. And I really believe that this reporting by Hawpe and other journalists added momentum to a growing movement of miners at that time that eventually reformed the United Mine Workers Union in 1972 and also really increased pressure on the government to establish a much fairer black lung benefits compensation program. So in 1972, I moved to Whitesburg to learn filmmaking at Apple Shop. And for the next almost 50 years, every time I saw David, he was very quick to remind me that he wrote the very first article about the Community Film Workshop Council of Appalachia, as Apple Shop was called at that time. It was published November 1969 when the doors at Apple Shop had hardly been open a month. So we appreciated that recognition. Hawpe didn't report from the coal fields for long, but clearly he lived up to his promise to do whatever he could as a journalist to prevent further mine disasters, and he clearly never forgot Eastern Kentucky. As was mentioned, he fought long and hard to keep the regional news bureaus, and the very finest reporters seemed to be hired for the Hazard Bureau. We subscribed to the paper, and we always felt that the Eastern Kentucky stories were written for us, not just for Louisville residents, that they were written with the intention to help us know what was going on, to inform us, and to help us be informed and engaged citizens of our region. Under Hawpe's leadership, the Courier undertook extensive reporting on events such as the 1976 Scotia mine disaster and its causes, but was also mentioned, just as importantly, committed time, talent, and resources into these lengthy investigations into the everyday mining industry practices that suffocated and killed Kentucky coal miners. The Courier-Journal reporters produced the 1982 Dying for Coal series on mine safety, and in 1998 published Dust, Deception, and Disease, a series which reported on illegal practices by coal mine operators that were causing the death of 1,500 workers from black lung disease every year. And as mentioned, of course, the Courier-Journal is widely recognized for its early coverage of the devastation that strip mining was causing in eastern Kentucky. The Courier's persistent reporting and editorializing about the 1982 broad-form deed constitutional amendment clarified the amendment's tricky language and really helped readers throughout the state understand why their vote to stop strip mining without the landowner's permission was important no matter where they lived. That amendment passed with 82% approval. So one of the questions being asked today is, what impact did this journalism have? I asked attorneys at the Appalachian Citizens Law Center who deal with mine safety and black lung cases every day for their perspective. Steve Sanders, retired ACLC director, said, "What I recall is that the Courier-Journal reporters were very, very good. They wanted to know about the person involved in the case and to understand the legal process as well. For example, Ralph Dunlop attended the trial before an administrative law judge of a mine safety case in the early 1980s. His article on the case was a front-page story as part of the Dying in Coal series. In the early 1990s, Gardner Harris attended an oral argument in a case I argued in the U.S. Court of Appeals in Cincinnati to get a full understanding of the process of an appeal of an individual miner's claim in the black lung benefit system. The Courier dedicated significant resources to cover these coal miners' cases when other publications did not see them as newsworthy." And current director of the Appalachian Citizens Law Center, Wes Addington, had this to say, "David Hawpe's columns and CJ editorials in 2006 and 2007 were crucial in getting the mine safety legislation passed in the Kentucky General Assembly. After the 2007 law was passed, Kentucky's mine safety laws were stronger than any other state's and stronger than federal law in a few areas. In one of the stories after the law was passed, Bill Kaler from the Kentucky Coal Association complained that in addition to the lobbying by the widows, the reporting and coverage in the Courier and the Lexington Herald-Leader had moved that bill. The 2007 legislation saved miners' lives, and I don't think it would have been passed without the constant pressure that Hawpe applied with his barrel of ink." Wes added, referring to Hawpe's last December column about the anniversary of Hurricane Creek, where he wrote there about that moment in Leslie County, that as I wandered back to the gym and scanned that awful scene, I promised myself that if I could ever do something as a journalist to help prevent another such horror, I would. Well, he certainly kept that promise.
Thank you very much, Mimi. When I left the Courier-Journal to come to UK in 2004, the paper didn't allow my replacement as political writer to have a column. That did not sit well with David. He was no longer editor, but he was running the opinion pages, and he said, "We've got to get you back in the paper." He knew that a chief political writer without a column, it's kind of like Barney Fife on the old Andy Griffith show. You got one bullet and it's in your pocket. If you're the lead political writer, you've got to be able to shoot through the spin and get to the truth. So the main reason that I still write political columns is that David Hawpe loved politics so much. He loved it so much that when he retired, he worked in the Senate campaign of Jack Conway, and finally for State Senator Morgan McGarvey of Louisville, who is the Senate Minority Leader, which is not an easy job, but he makes it look easy. The senator is with us today, along with Philip Shepard, one of the two judges of the Franklin Circuit Court, our state's most important trial court because it handles so many cases involving state government. They will talk about David's love for politics, and we will start with Judge Shepard.
Thank you, Al. You see, I'm happy that Al is following the old adage of age before beauty and splitting the time between me and Morgan. I also want to say what a joy it is to be on this panel with so many friends and so many people here in the audience. And I have to make one point of personal privilege here, sitting next to my neighbor and friend Richard Wilson. One of the last times I was with David, we had stopped by to visit Richard at his house, and as we were leaving, we were walking out toward the car, and David looked at me and he said, "You know, no matter how old I am or how much I've accomplished in life, I'm always trying to please Richard Wilson." But our topic, Morgan and I are supposed to talk about David's political views, and David loved politics, and I think he even loved politicians, although he was happy to scorch them when they deserved it. But like most people with great minds, David evolved, I think, in many ways in his political views over time, and David kind of changed the trajectory of my life when he introduced me to one of his mentors, Ed Pritchard, the great New Deal lawyer who was a mentor to David and became a mentor to me. And Mr. Pritchard was fond of reminding David that he had started his political involvement in Kentucky as a supporter of Happy Chandler and against the young liberal candidate, Ned Breathitt. And I think that's a sign of David's kind of contrarian streak. I think as a student at UK, all the cool kids and the frat boys probably were for Ned Breathitt, and David took the other route. But over time, David evolved, I think, into what I would call a reconstructed New Deal liberal. I think David's political philosophy was probably best summarized by the great statement of FDR in terms of his belief about government, that better to have a government better to have the occasional excesses of a government that lives in the spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. And I think that in many ways sums up David's views of the role of government. I think his experience in Eastern Kentucky and his experience in seeing the civil rights movement unfold really deeply affected him and imbued him with a real determination to make democracy work for the outcast, the disinherited, the people who were left out in society. And I think certainly his experience in Eastern Kentucky in dealing with a region where the social and the economic power was concentrated so heavily in the hands of a very few people, and the result of that in terms of the impoverishment of a whole class of people, the inadequate public resources available in education and healthcare, all of those things I think really helped shape his view about the role of government, and it caused him to be, notwithstanding his criticism of LBJ that Richard has shared with us, it caused him to become a liberal in the best sense of the word. And I think David would say probably that, I think David would say that the biggest lie that Bill Clinton ever told was that the era of big government is over. David believed in big government because he believed that in a democracy, if we're going to solve big problems, we've got to have a big government that is capable of taking on those problems, the problems of public education, of health care, of protecting the environment. Big challenges are going to require government to be effective and to be adequately funded. Later in life, David, who had been, I think, a severe critic of our Republican governor of the era of his time in Eastern Kentucky, came around to, I think, having quite a bit of admiration for Louis Nunn because Governor Nunn took on reform of the mental health system in Kentucky. And he also took on the funding of education with the increase in the sales tax. Those are things which I'd say are likely not going to happen again in a Republican administration. But David developed an appreciation for politicians of either party who are willing to take on big problems and to use the power of government to address the real problems that face Kentuckians of every station. So that was a real passion of his, and I think also that passion was informed by his, very unique life experience in terms of having a deep, deep personal connection to people in rural Kentucky, particularly in eastern Kentucky, and in the state's urban center of Louisville. There's such great tension between those divergent regions and economies that David was really one of the few people who really deep in his bones, I think, understood the lives of people in the mountains and in the rural areas of Kentucky, and also the need for a great, vibrant urban center in Louisville, and that informed his journalism, and it certainly informed, I think, his political views as well. So those were some of the factors that I think made him a really great editor. They made him a great friend, and they made him have a great impact on the state of Kentucky. All of that, I think underneath all of that, there were several driving forces that shaped David's views, and I think appropriately, a lot of his political philosophy was informed by that great Louisville native Louis Brandeis, who is famous for sayings like "sunshine is the best disinfectant." I think he believed deep down in his bones that government secrecy, and we're going to hear more about this from John Fleischaker and Kim Green, but that's the enemy of democracy, and I think that his views on that really formed a powerful drive for openness and transparency that made Kentucky much better. And I think the other thing that he felt very deeply was another famous saying of Brandeis was that in a democracy, the highest office is that of citizen. And I think that he really felt the great importance of civic involvement from the most humble person to the highest and mightiest. And I think that he felt like democracy didn't really work unless we included everybody at the table, and that we really worked to make government effective and work for everybody, not just for the people who had wealth and power. So those were the things that I think informed his politics, and I think Senator McGarvey is going to tell us a little bit more about the practical side of politics that he engaged in the last few years.
Leader McGarvey.
Thank you, Mr. Cross, and thank you, Judge. As an ostensibly practicing attorney, I still have to refer to Judge Shepard as Judge Shepard. As a legislator, and today in Frankfort, he gets to generically refer to me as defendant. It's wild times we live in right now. Judge Shepard mentioned that David even occasionally liked politicians, and it makes me think there are very few things I ever got to do for David. But I introduced him to three people during the time of our relationship. I got to introduce him to Bill Clinton, which he loved, to Barack Obama, which he loved, and to Rex Chapman. And I tell you that because of the three, the only one of whom he requested a picture with was Rex Chapman. And John Fleischaker, who was at that game in what was 1986 when Rex Chapman came in as a freshman to Freedom Hall and dropped 26 on U of L, is still one of his favorite stories. So I give you a little bit of background before I get into David's and my time in Frankfort, because I think a lot of people think that's when our relationship started, and not at all. David moved four doors down from us when I was about 6 years old. And how I got to know David was when he would come over for my dad's batter cakes or my mom's pies or the occasional ball game. And, I got to know him growing up. And then I even had long hair down to about my shoulders and was far more interested in what his son Chris was doing for a living than what David did for a living during that time period. But we grew up together. And it was really in about 2002 when I came back from college, I started working on a campaign for Jack Conway. And we've mentioned how much David loves politics. And he loves politics. He loves politics in part because of what he believes is capable from our government. And he saw as one of his long-standing enemies at the Courier-Journal, as a citizen, as Brandeis would have said, as Ann Northup. And any of you who know David know about his relationship with Ann Northup. And I was working for Jack Conway against Ann Northup, which he, of course, believed there was no higher calling in 2002 than to work on a campaign against Ann Northup. In fact, you know, David and I, he was my volunteer chief of staff. He actually ranged between intern and chief of staff, depending on the day was his title with me. And he came up for 8.5 years. He never missed a day in Frankfurt with me. And unless the kids were in the car as we were driving them to school at St. Matthew's Elementary, whenever we passed Representative Northup's house on Lexington Road, he would often still wave with one finger. True. He actually said a word to go along with it from time to time that I won't repeat, as this could be rebroadcast. But, you know, he finally retired from the Courier-Journal. I just say this because I really, growing up, was oblivious to the figure and the titan that he was. He was just David down the street. And like you saw him do with so many people, when he met you, he became interested in you and in your story. And I just got to know him, and of course, for some reason, got to love him. And when he retired from the Courier-Journal, he was looking for something to do, and I was working at that time for Jack Conway, who was running for the U.S. Senate. And I said, David, you've always wanted to work for a campaign. Come on. And so he came onto the campaign in 2010, and this, I think, the reason I bring that up, I think this begins David's political education, because he'd always covered it. He'd always been a part of it, but he'd never been inside of it. And in one of the underreported political stories of the last decade is that David was one of the people that they went to for approval on the infamous Aqua Buddha ad. Which, of course, coming from the Courier-Journal with David's fighting spirit, he says, yes, run it. Run it. Run it. And then, of course, they did. We know what happened in the fallout. And that's when David first learned that outside of the ivory tower of the Courier-Journal, when you throw punches, occasionally you can hit yourself. And he went from there, and then, of course, we continued to be in touch, and I decided to run for the state senate in 2012, and, of course, he was just 110% on board. But I thought it was interesting because as much as he loved politics, as much as he loved being in the fray, I learned on that campaign he was far better as a coach or a referee than an offensive lineman. Because it was that day that was the weekend before the election. And of course, I'm running in a 4-way primary. We're all knocking on doors. He comes out to the Saturday morning thing where we're all leaving to knock on doors. And an hour later, I get the call that he is at home curled up in a ball on his couch because he could not handle the nerves that we might possibly lose. And so when I won, then of course, we made the deal that he was going to come to Frankfurt with me. And he was going to come and he was going to learn. He was going to be there and I was going to learn from him. And we were going to have this great relationship. But I go back to how our relationship started because, again, I didn't understand the depths of his career and the potential enemies David had made over 40 years covering Frankfurt. And it was Ben Chandler, who is truly one of my great mentors in life and in politics, who called me up and said, "What are you doing, Morgan?" And I was like, this is interesting. Well, I'm taking David. It's going to be great to have a little help. Well, of course, the person who I replaced, Tim Shaughnessy, had retired. And Tim Shaughnessy was a great guy, but known for an Irish temper and a quick fuse. And he actually wrote out a list of people for me to go see. And he said, go see these people and tell them you're not me. And one of them was David Williams, the president of the Senate who took over and had run the place with an iron fist and was a target of David's every day that he was in power and every day that David was at the Courier. And so I go into David Williams' office, and he sits there, and he brings someone else, and he says, I'd like you to introduce you to Morgan McGarvey. He's going to be joining us here in the Senate. He's the young protege of David Hawpe, who wrote all those nasty things about me that are hanging on the wall back there, and then pointed to a row of editorials written by David hanging up in his office, calling him just about every name in the book. I should have had an alarm at that point, but I didn't. And so he comes to Frankfurt with me, and it's the very first week. And we come in through the tunnel in the basement, We get on the elevator, go to the second floor, and the doors open up on the first floor. Ding. In walks the Speaker of the House, Greg Stumbo from East Kentucky. You know, he's this large political figure. I'm a freshman legislator. He's the Speaker of the House. He comes into the elevator with his entourage. He looks at David. He looks at me. And he goes, "Is he with you?" I said, "Yes, Mr. Speaker." And he looks back at David and he goes, "Shit ass." Ding! The doors open on the second floor and we get out. And of course, I look at David with eyes the size of saucer plates thinking, what have we gotten into here? And David says, he deserved everything I ever wrote about him. And maybe more. So began our tenure in Frankfurt. And truly, for the next 8.5 years, I drove him up every day because we're supposed to talk about his professional life. But any of you who ever rode in a car with David probably got a better life insurance policy if you planned on doing it again. He was a terrible driver. So I drove him to Frankfurt every day. And with his family here, with Chris and Linda in particular, I want to thank you for allowing me that time with him. Because I know it interfered with day-to-day daycare and all sorts of meals and everything else. He stayed up with me every minute. And there are a few people today on today's panel who can say that they were David's boss. I can tell you that it made no difference. He cared so deeply about the issues that, and I think someone earlier said that he had no filter. Maybe that was Steve Ford. He never did. In fact, I remember we were sitting there in the office and a group of people came in and they started complaining about some of the students in the public schools. We just see David working up. And I'm thinking, please let this meeting end before he goes off. They keep talking and he can't stand it anymore. And he says, "Are you saying my grandchildren are failures? Are you saying I'm a failure?" And then he just dresses them down in only the way that David could do, with words put together so that they felt about 3 inches tall when they walked out of my office. And I looked at him, I said, "David, you can't do that." And he said, "What did you expect me to do? Say nothing?" And I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I expected you to do." And he says, "Well, I can't do that." And I said, "Well, when your name is on the door of this office, then you can say whatever you want. When it's my name on the door of this office, we probably shouldn't make our supporters and constituents feel that small when they come up to Frankfurt to meet with their representative," which, of course, he immediately got up and left. And the next time a group came in to talk about public education, he stood up from his table, straightened his coat, flipped back his always perfectly coiffed hair, looked at me, snorted, and walked out of the room so I could have the meeting by myself. So was Madam Hawpe. Many of our times together, you know, we had so many debates on the newsletter that were followed by long periods of silence or snotty quips the next time I asked a question of, "Well, whatever you think." I learned later he would often call Philip Shepard to vent about some of his things. But the reality is he was a wonderful staffer, and the picture there actually sets it up. My desk was in the opposite side of the office, and there were 2 chairs in front of it, and there sat David at this little round table. And he sat there with his laptop open, sort of like a 21st century Madame Defarge. And people noticed, and this is when I really learned about David. It was our first session, and people from the PSC came in, and the guy kept looking behind him, and finally looks at me and goes, "What is he doing here?" And he was wonderful. He never wanted the limelight. He held court in our office. He helped me with everything. He was an enormous source of wisdom and information, and of course I could yell at him too, and he would take it all in stride, which prevented me from yelling at other people on the floor. He was a protector. You know, the Wayne Gretzky, the story about Wayne Gretzky, the famous hockey player, is that he scored all these goals, but whenever he played, Marty McSorley was on his team, and Marty McSorley was the enforcer. And I had David Hawpe with me for 8.5 years, and I can't think of a better Marty McSorley than David Hawpe, because he was so fiercely loyal to things he cared about and people he believed in. He loved it. He loved seeing Frankfurt. He loved being in it from the inside. He so loved Kentucky. And he loved the drama and the stories of the Kentucky legislature, whether it was the turkey at one point released on the House floor, the pistol that Dottie Purdy kept strapped underneath her skirt, whether it was the time that Leslie Combs accidentally fired a shot while we were working there in the annex while showing her gun to Jeff Greer. He understood Kentucky, and he understood what the legislature meant to Kentucky, because say what you want to about us, we are not a do-nothing legislature. But I think one of the themes that Judge Shepard hit upon is his evolvement. And I think David did evolve. He came in and he gained these new opinions, which, by the way, David had the uncanny ability to present opinion as fact, and he often did. But it was good for us when he presented those. He made no bones about the fact he was a team player for my party. But he learned in the legislature that politics is rarely black and white. That like the issues we confront, the people who address them are often complex. And that doesn't mean he spared anyone any grace when he disagreed with them. But he understood that you could have those disagreements and have to come back and work with those same people on a different issue at a different time. I miss him, and I think we all do. And of course, what I loved most about our time in Frankfurt, aside from the stories which I could tell for hours, were the car rides. And I think Al mentioned that he was an unpaid staffer in my office. David's only request for payment is that when we drove to and from Frankfurt, that I not be on the phone, that we get that time together. And for an hour every day, 2 hours every day, we would talk. And I learned so much about the Courier and about the history of Kentucky and the history of Louisville and politics. And I learned from him about how to be tough and how to be tough the right way for the right reasons. And I think one thing that maybe hasn't been touched on with David enough was also his love of the aesthetic. He loved the beauty in life. That's part of the reason he loved the legislature and he loved politics, because as biting as some of his insults could be, he was always pushing with those insults for something better. And he appreciated what was getting accomplished. But whether it was the slam dunk in a basketball game, whether it was the snow crystals on the grass as we drove into Frankfurt, the beautiful moon, or the occasional setting of a sun when it got deep into March and the days got longer, David appreciated that beauty in life. And I appreciated that beauty in him.
You mean he didn't use his favorite line when you upbraided him? He liked to say, "I plead guilty and pledge reform." Any good newspaper editor needs a lawyer to keep you out of court and to help keep you in business if you get hauled into court. At the junction of law and journalism stands a principle: the need to protect and defend the freedom granted to journalists by the First Amendment to the Constitution. That requires not just good attorneys, but lawyers who are committed to freedom of information and the public's right to know as a personal mission. Two of those lawyers are a husband and wife team: John Fleischaker, the chief author and defender of Kentucky's open government laws, and Kim Green, who worked many years with him and is now retired. They will talk about what it was like to have David Hawpe as a client and the battles they fought for the public interest. John and Kim.
Thank you, Al.
Wrong slide.
That was not what it was like. So when I became a lawyer in 1980, determined to practice media law, there just weren't very many women lawyers around at that time. And so, there were a lot of male lawyers in my law firm who were a little bit shy about exposing their good clients to the women lawyers. Would their clients accept them? I was lucky that was not the case for me. But when I finally got to go over to the Courier and work with a reporter to review a story he had created. No, he didn't create it. He didn't make it up. That's not what I meant. He had written. It was still a novelty in some of their eyes. And in fact, there was one reporter who actually announced, after I pointed out some things that he might want to look more deeply into in his story, that, well, he thought he would just wait and get a second opinion from the real lawyer. But that was not David at all. David was welcoming and accepting and trusting and ready to go with the legal advice that he was offered by either one of us most of the time. He was, in my career, one of the real bright lights that I had the opportunity to work with. I noticed that journalism draws a lot of people that you might characterize as characters. And principal among them, in my experience, were David, of course, and Max Heath from Ncaa, who we also lost this year. A great loss to our community. David was an icon to me. The principal jobs that we had as lawyers for the newspapers were to review stories pre-publication, right? To see if there were any things that needed to be beefed up or corrected, to avoid libel, invasion of privacy, that sort of thing. And when there was the rare defamation or invasion of privacy case, to deal with that, and to deal with access issues. Nothing stuck under David's craw worse than public officials who didn't act the way he thought they should. And yes, the quote about sunshine being the greatest disinfectant, that was David through and through. He believed that transparency in government was essential to our democracy, and by golly, he was going to enforce that every opportunity, including even against his beloved, the University of Kentucky, long before Dr. Capilouto's tenure here, when the university refused to turn over to the public its report to the Ncaa all those years ago about violations of certain Ncaa rules in the basketball program. He was that serious about access to government information. He also, when he got a notion about what's right and what's wrong, he wouldn't stop. He would pursue it until the bitter end, until he got the result that he thought was appropriate and that the law supported. One example, there was a request he wanted made to the Hardin County school system for information about discipline records in their school system-wide. And they relied upon a federal statute that protects individual student information, private information. Well, he thought that was not only a disingenuous, but a stupid response, a stupid reason for denying, because he wasn't asking for individual student information. He wanted statistics. He wanted to see how the trends were, and particularly with racial discrepancies in their disciplinary practices. So we pursued that through multiple levels of the court system until he got the result he wanted. Yes, of course, we're entitled to see those types of statistics. And he would frequently crow about that result and use it to his benefit in his arguments against other state officials, well, not just state officials, but officials at all levels who thought they could weasel around the open records and open meetings laws. but the one who has most of the juicy stories about working with David as his counselor is sitting to my right here. So I am going to pass the microphone to him so that you can get some real good stuff.
This is one instance when age before beauty doesn't apply.
Oh, thank you. What?
When
Wait a minute. Okay.
beauty goes first. Okay. I had 50 years of friendship and a professional relationship with David. David was part of I believe the class of 1969 of some very talented reporters that joined the Courier. I started practicing law at the law firm that represented the Courier in 1970 and became involved in very important Supreme Court case, the Brandsburg case in 1971, and from there on really established some relationships with these young reporters, and I was a young lawyer. That was extraordinary in terms of, I think, what we accomplished and what we were able to do. I think it needs to be said that we were all beneficiaries of the Bingham family, and especially of Barry Bingham Jr., who gave us free rein, basically free rein, and believed in what we were doing. That was a godsend to Hawpe. It was a godsend to me. We just were a bunch of young people, I think, appropriately trying to raise hell, and did a pretty darn good job of it. So there's a lot to go around here. David was a great client. He was a great client because of a couple things. He was a great writer. He could write with ease. He could write better than anybody I've seen or watched do it, with an ease and an ability that few people have. However, that ease and that ability and that willingness to speak often produced stories or editorials that were not taken with great kindness by some people in the community. I cannot, I'm hindered somewhat here. I cannot talk about an awful lot of stuff that I know about what transpired, because obviously attorney-client relationships, but I will tell you that it would probably dozens and dozens and dozens of times, probably into the hundreds of times over that 40 years that he was my client, that he would call and say, would you read this editorial? Would you read this story? I would read it, and I would call back and say, you know, this is really great, but can we change this word? Can we restate this in a way that's really not going to, quite frankly, piss off everybody who reads it? And we would have a discussion, and David and I would always come to an agreement on how to restate something, because we both thought it was important. David thought it was extremely important to get it in the paper. It was the kind of relationship that I think not many lawyers have with clients. We were friends. We could talk honestly with each other, openly. We got so we could use shorthand with each other. He knew where I was coming from. I knew where he was coming from. Before I go any further, I want to talk about Morgan's story about David erupting at a UK basketball game. That was a UK U of L game that I had used our law firm tickets, and we had great seats, and Kim's father was there, a big UK fan. A good friend of mine was there, Bob Atkins, who was a big UK fan. And in fact, Hawpe did erupt. And the woman in front of us, a U of L season ticket holder, turned around and told me that she was going to report us to U of L, that this was an outrage that these people got tickets to the U of L UK game at Freedom Hall. I had a good defense. This was a client. Hawpe was a client. He didn't act as a client. He really was outrageous that day, but he certainly enjoyed it. He certainly enjoyed it. I think the other thing that I have thought a lot about was that David was a huge defender of First Amendment, huge defender of transparency. He understood about 80 to 90% of it. He didn't understand everything. We had some really serious discussions about how far you can go, where you can go, what you can say. I don't think he would be upset if I told you that there were several instances where he didn't quite understand that it was a two-lane road. That as Morgan said, or somebody said, if you throw punches, you're going to get hit a few times. There were a number of times he called me saying, "Can we sue so and so because he said something about me and I don't like it." And he was insistent. I think Betty knows that. He was insistent. He thought he should be able to sue. I had a pat answer to him: people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. He seemed to understand that. I had a goal in my professional life that David Hawpe would never be put under oath. It took a lot of work in certain cases to avoid that, and we were totally successful until a more recent case in which he had to testify. I don't believe I've ever worked harder to try to prepare a witness for a deposition. He came through it fine. He was pretty nervous. He came through it fine. It was a political case in which we had been sued for defamation on a story and an editorial in which we had serious problems. And he came through it fine. I will say that he hated being criticized. He was very sensitive about being criticized. He took it personally as well as professionally. We had another case that I recall where a person who had, I think at that point was still affiliated with the University of Kentucky, but had been here when David was a student. And David wrote an editorial. I did not see it till it was published, I say in my defense, in which he called the guy a bagman. And he got sued, and he said, "What's wrong with that?" Well, as complicated sometimes as constitutional cases are, that was our basic defense. What's so wrong with that? And we ended up settling that case for a correction, not a retraction. But we either called it a correction or something else. We refused to call it a retraction. But we basically said when we called him a bagman, we didn't mean he was this. We thought he was that. 2 weeks later, I was at a seminar in New York with media law attorneys, and a speaker got up and said, "I've got to read you this retraction. It's the best retraction I've ever read." So I called David and said, "You really came out the winner on this thing. You've been cited now as having the best retraction, best correction in the United States." Two cases I want to talk about very briefly because I think they were extremely important. Kim mentioned one, which was the University of Kentucky case dealing with the Ncaa, a decision, I think in the early 90s we got that decision. But basically, it was an effort by the University of Kentucky to not release its findings on an Ncaa investigation that it had delivered to the Ncaa. We won that case in the Kentucky Supreme Court with a terrific decision, very important decision, that basically stood for the proposition that our open meetings law didn't apply to requests by other people to keep things secret. That just because the Ncaa wanted it secret, that made no difference. That has come in extremely handy in a lot of cases. The second case, which balances the first case, was a case against the University of Louisville in which we sued to open up the University of Louisville Foundation, an extraordinarily important case. The University of Louisville was taking the position that the foundation, which held all of the money of the university, made all of the financial decisions for the university, was not a public agency. What I find really, we won that case. We won it. We were trying to find out the donors for the McConnell program, which has just been initiated. Those donors, the university refused to give us the names of those donors because they had given their money to the foundation, not to the University of Louisville. We won that every which way. We not only won the case that they were a public agency, but we won the proposition that donors to public agencies did not have a right of privacy that they had with regard to their donations. Senator McConnell, in a tribute he wrote for David after David died, mentioned that case and misstated a fact. What Senator McConnell said was that after that case came out, that David found out who the donors were and agreed that it was the right thing to do, that it made no difference. Well, the fact of the matter is that nobody knew who those donors were because the Supreme Court said that they were those 62 donors, 62 or 63 donors, would remain private because they had a good faith belief that they would be private. I was the only one who had seen the list of all of the donors. David Hawpe never saw the list, ever. David Hawpe never told, I believe, with all sincerity, never told McConnell that, yeah, you were right, or yeah, it was okay. That just didn't happen. And I think that needs to be said publicly, so I decided to use this forum to say it publicly. Finally, in David's tenure, long tenure, we not only went after the universities, we went after law enforcement. We had 40 years, we've now had 40 years of court decisions saying that we're entitled to internal affairs records and the like with regard to law enforcement. We've spent 40 years trying to do that, and we shouldn't have had to do that because it all started with a 1983 case in which we won that premise. However, with all due respect to certain people here, I will tell you that in my experience, starting with the drafting and the initial enactment of the open records law, the two biggest opponents to transparency have been law enforcement and universities. And that has remained constant. And I think that was a real irritant for David. And I think David was extraordinarily pleased when the University of Kentucky lost its case in the Supreme Court when it had sued its own newspaper, its own student newspaper, on a series of stories about Title IX investigations. The newspaper was exactly right. There was no privacy. The sources came to the newspaper voluntarily, and the Supreme Court of Kentucky's decision is remarkable in that it basically lectures the university going back to the 1983 case that we started with, saying this is established law. And I told David that that should be one of his proudest moments because not only was he right, but everything we had done for 40 years resulted in a landmark decision in 2020. So he continues to be a force. One final thing, this is very personal. David for years had told me I needed to watch The Wire, the series. He said, it's a great series. I never did. He said, you gotta watch episode 5 of The Wire because it's about media, and media coverage of an event in Baltimore. And I finally started watching it this summer. And I finished it after David died. And I went into Kim and I said, it's a huge regret because right now I really want to talk to him about this, and I can't do it. He was a great friend, a super client, and I know that his presence will be felt for a very long time, and we miss him. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Kim. David Hawpe could have been a great editor anywhere, and he chose to stay in Kentucky. But he was still a nationally known figure in journalism. One reason was that he helped the news industry get serious about diversity, the idea that a news outlet's staff and coverage should reflect its diverse communities. His efforts for diversity are mentioned in your printed program, but to give us a more personal taste of how David practiced what he preached, we are glad to have with us Betty Winston-Baye, retired reporter and editorial writer for the Courier-Journal, and a member of the Hall of Fame of the National Association of Black Journalists. Please welcome Betty Baye.
Thank you, Al. I just wanted to say that I got word of David's death when I was on my way out of the country. And I felt so alone, and I cried because David Hawpe was my friend. He was my boss. He was a mentor, but he was my friend. And I tried to think of what to say today about David. Oh God, that's the barbecue picture. I don't even know. Thank you, that's a better one. But when I think about David, or what I thought about what I wanted to say, I'm gonna mangle a poem. But I thought, what is the measure of a man? What is the measure of a man? And is it strength? Is it intelligence? Is it fearlessness? Is it the ability to lead others down the right path? The ability to inspire the seed of greatness in those who need encouragement. No one could question David's intelligence, his leadership. There are all kinds of plaques and championships, things that will this today to talk about David's greatness. But those are the measuring sticks that the world uses to define a man. What cannot be measured is the soul of a man. David had soul. David was my boss and my brother and my friend. And I loved David because he was decent and he had integrity and he was a bright light. And I knew, and all of us who were people of color, and particularly African Americans at the paper, we knew that behind the scenes, David had to fight good fights for us because not everybody wanted us there. And not everybody thought that we could be good journalists. I think they say the true measure of a man is the legacy that he leaves behind. And everybody on this panel, in one way or another, has been warmed by David's fire. I talked to some of the people who were at the Courier-Journal, and Cheryl Duval, who's now in California, described David as an ally before that word was cool to say, that he was an ally. Mark McCormick, who is now back home in Kansas, talked about the day his mother came to visit the Courier-Journal and how David showed his mother around and assured her that Mark would be okay. Michael Days recalled how when he and his wife Angela, also a journalist, were getting married, the weather shifted. They had an outdoor ceremony. And he remembered David being one of the ones to grab the flowers to take it inside. And for me, when we were in New York for a National Association of Black Journalists convention, David wanted to see where I grew up in East Harlem. And I took David with me to the project, the housing project where I grew up. And they were honoring me that day because, you know, at home, they thought I was a big deal because I made it into Ebony magazine. You know, they didn't care about the New York Times. If you got in Ebony, you know, you were over. And that day it rained. It started raining, and this was a celebration of the project, and everybody would cook and have their food. And my mother had to move her table and everything inside. So David sat in the hallway with my mom and our friends, and David sat there eating ham and whatever Mommy had prepared. And my mother said to David, take care of my daughter, because I never dreamed that I would live in Kentucky. I am truly a girl from Harlem and the Lower East Side in Manhattan. And I can say for a long time I thought I was Jewish because I grew up on the Lower East Side, and the synagogue was there in the middle of the block. And so I thought I was one of the Jewish kids. And my first best friend was a Jewish girl named Deborah. And my mother got pregnant, and I begged her to name the baby Deborah. And Deborah's mother had those numbers on her arm, but I was too young to understand what that meant until years later. But she was my friend, and she taught me how to skate. And, you know, I would go to her house and sit with her. She was my friend. And so taking David to the project. Now, whose boss wants to go home to see where they come from? David wanted to see where I came from. And he was so happy to be there. And my mother and everybody, they were fussing over David and everything. And my mother told me that after we left, the people in the project said, yeah, Betty said that was her boss. She came back here with her white man. You know? Yeah, you know, that's not her boss, that's her man. So we laughed about that. A few years later, when my mother died, in 1996, I looked up and David was there. He flew from Kentucky to New York to be there for my mother's funeral. What measure of a man. And I think David was the only white person in the building. And African Americans have a way of marching around the casket. And so David didn't even march. He just sat there like stunned by the whole thing, and that the minister came out singing, you know. And I thought about that. He flew back the next day. He took the time to come to my mother's funeral. He was my friend. David Hawpe. I measured David Hawpe by his humanity, his true desire to know me and to know my people, to know my history, to know the music that I love, and my aspirations, and even my pain. And David knew when I got those horrible letters and the things that people would say about me in response to my editorial, it hurt, and I would get like accolades. But when people called me all kind of niggas and porch monkeys, some expressions I had never heard in my life, David was there for me, and he encouraged me to go on and to write. David believed in me. He believed in many of us. And one of my regrets, and I hate to be so emotional, but I didn't get a chance because I was gone. But David would always say that I said, David, I want to go to Appalachia with you. I wanted to go with David so he could return the favor and show me a world that was absolutely unlike the world that I grew up in. And as if to be sure that I would never forget him, David Hawpe passed away on July 18th, which is my late father's birthday. I always think, rest well, David, because your legacy is safe with me. It's safe with the National Association of Black Journalists members, many of whom never worked with you, but you came to our conventions every year. You encouraged people. You gave people jobs. You gave people advice. Like an eternal flame, David Hawpe will burn in my life forever, and he will burn for generations in the light and light the way for Black journalists and journalists of color yet unborn. I thank Linda and the family for sharing David Hawpe with me. And I thank Carol Sutton for encouraging me to come to Kentucky so I could meet David Hawpe, so that I could see a world that was so different than what I knew. And everybody had fun with me, and I will tell you, I will love George Clooney forever. Because one year, they always wanted me to have a good experience at the Courier-Journal to show the girl from New York, and they sent me to the Kentucky Derby to cover Millionaire's Row. So I'm on Millionaire's Row, and I've got on my best black slacks and a white blouse, and I'm interviewing Rosemary Clooney. And we're having this wonderful interview. Now, before I left, some of the reporters said they're going to mistake you for a waitress. So I'm interviewing Rosemary Clooney, and the next thing I know, somebody's digging me in my back and saying they need drinks at table 18. Rosemary Clooney turned a bright shade of red. She's not a waitress, she's a reporter. And let me tell you something, where I come from, people do not become reporters, do not become journalists, do not go to the White House, do not sit in editorial boardrooms with people who are high up in society. But David Hawpe, as high as we met those times with President Clinton and whoever it was, David Hawpe cared about the little people. And David Hawpe cared about me. And David Hawpe cared about many of us who were black at the Courier-Journal. And David Hawpe had our backs. And we knew he had our backs. And we knew that he fought for us. And I will say this, my departure from the Courier-Journal, I suspect, would have been a lot different if Hawpe was still there. If David Hawpe was still there to have my back, to make sure that I was taken care of. So I didn't mean to get so emotional or so personal, but David means so much to me and so much to so many. He was a great journalist, a great friend. I will never forget him, and I will always know that David is one of the pillars that has made this little girl from the projects that made my life a better life and showed me something different. So thank you, David Hawpe. I miss you. I can't even imagine the world without you. But I know I'm going to be okay because you helped me to navigate when so many people were against me. And when you give me strength and my power, I will work. And I will remember July 18th forever. And then when I celebrate my father, every year I will remember David Hawpe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betty. So much. You know, I got 500 words here about diversity. That's all we need right there. Give her a hand again. David Hawpe is also a leader of Kentucky newspapers, serving as president of the Kentucky Press Association in 1990. Here's a recent picture of him with some other past presidents, including our own Ryan Craig, Colonel Advisor and part-time journalism instructor in the middle of the back row. Most of the people in this picture are from rural Kentucky, which David appreciated a lot more than people who live in metropolitan areas do. He knew that it's much harder to do great journalism in rural places, and he helped the Press Association help them. To talk about that, and anything else he wants to talk about, because he knew David a long time, is the longest-serving executive director of a press association in North America, KPA's David Thompson.
Thank you, Al. 2021 has been a sad year for Kentucky newspapers. In March, we lost Al Smith. In May, we lost Tim Kelly. July the 18th, we lost David Hawpe. In August, we lost Max Heath. And about 10 days ago, we lost Ron Jenkins. All 5 of those are members of the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame. All 5 of those are giants in this industry. And we have lost already this year. David was president of KPA in 1990, as Al mentioned. Followed by 1 year a guy named Larry Craig, and if you know Larry Craig, that's kind of like the odd couple. They were polar opposites. Always enjoyed anytime we had a board meeting or any kind of executive committee meeting to hear those two get into it on debates, because they were so opposite of each other. But they were very close friends. As Al said, David well respected the weekly newspapers in the state and the weekly newspaper people. Each year we ask the incoming president to come up with one program, one service, one project that we can offer to our member newspapers, hopefully at no cost to them. Let KPA pay for it. And each year we get some pretty good ideas. John Nelson, our 2004 president, is here. John's idea was to go to every county, school board, jail, and city and conduct an open records audit. How well did public agencies respond to requests for public records? David Hawpe was very supportive of that, to the point that he made sure that some of the 400 journalists, and about 100 of those being college journalism students, fanned out across the state on one day in October to go to these and ask the city for a budget, ask for the county judge executive's expense report, ask for the contract of the school superintendent, and for a copy of the jail log. And just to keep things fun, we asked for each state-supported university to give us a copy of the president's contract. This was done secretive. Now, you can imagine trying to come up with that kind of a project, and we did not want any of the public agencies to know about this. We pulled it off. David made sure we had some Courier-Journal reporters involved. He also made sure that the Courier-Journal helped prepare a special section that was distributed to every newspaper, as well as all the legislators, about just how public agencies were responding to public records. So David had support there. David's project was one that, in essence, continues today. He knew that weekly newspapers across the state, a state that's so wide, could not get reporters to come to Frankfort to cover a story, to take a photograph, to drive to Frankfort to get an open record, or to come to cover the legislature. He wanted every newspaper, especially the weeklies, to have a full-time reporter based at KPA that reported to the newspapers, and all they had to do was call the office and say, I need this story covered, I need this picture taken, please go to this cabinet or wherever the case might be, get this record for me and send it to me. And then we also developed a Friday legislative wrap-up because they had no means to find out what was going on in Frankfort other than the legislators who were writing their columns about how good of a job they were doing. But David's commitment was to the weekly newspapers. He knew the Ben Gishes. He knew the Larry Craigs. He knew that those small newspapers could not afford to get anyone to Frankfort. They didn't have the means to let them travel, to have a full-time reporter there. That was his goal. That service, the Kentucky Press News Bureau, continued until 2009. We then switched it to the Kentucky Press News Service, and it stayed in effect until April of 2020. We did shut it down for a year. We opened it at the end of this August as AP Story Share. It's a news sharing, but it still grew out of David's idea back in 1990 that he wanted to make sure every newspaper in this state had the opportunity to know what's going on in government, to have stories for their readers, that they just didn't have to write or report what somebody else wrote for them. and made it easy for them to get public records. David was also quite involved in the Legislative Defense Committee, Legal Defense Fund Committee that we started on August 1st of 1996. That was a program where we were helping fund newspapers, especially smaller newspapers who could not afford to go to court to protect a lawsuit that might be filed against them, that we would reimburse the newspaper up to 50% of its legal expenses. And to this date, we have given back nearly $1 million to newspapers in Kentucky who have found themselves in a court situation where they probably would not have followed through had it not been for the Legal Defense Fund. David was a very proud member of that Legal Defense Fund committee, and I know John Nelson and I are going to miss him on that because of his insight and his commitment to make sure these newspapers get taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. As I mentioned earlier, what makes this a symposium is that we want to talk a little bit about the current state of journalism and the future of journalism and how David's career might inform that. Journalism and the news business that pays for it, they are two separate things, face challenges today, including a debate between those who put a premium on objectivity, more precisely the objective method in reporting and writing as a means of presenting a fair, accurate, and thorough report, and those who are more opinion-driven and say journalists should report more from a point of view, delivering truth as they see it. I think David believed that we can never be truly objective and will always bring our own experiences and points of view to our reporting, and that they can enrich that reporting, which should go through a rigorous editing process to produce the most reliable report. But today we live in a world where people seek out more affirmation than information. They have a proliferation of information sources. And I said 20 years ago when I was SBJ president that the market for opinion in this country was increasing and the market for fact was decreasing. And at some point, that becomes bad for democracy. So how should journalism serve democracy at a time like this? Does it need to emphasize more opinion and point of view? David was an editorialist really longer than he was an editor. Or does it need to adhere to that principle of not pure objectivity, but the objective method? And at this point, we open the discussion to anybody on the panel and anybody in the audience to share whatever views they might have on this particular point. Steve, you want to take a crack at it? Because I think you mentioned it in your remarks about David's editorial philosophy.
You're dealing with very old technology. How do you turn this damn thing
Just turn the switch up. Push it up. Yeah, give it a try.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Who knew? I think I'm going to address that in a kind of roundabout way. I think David tended to view people who ran newsrooms as some of them being leaders and some of them being managers. I think David thought of himself as a leader, and he was. He had to kind of be dragooned into playing the role of manager on occasion. So he tended to think that the ideal newspaper hierarchy, as did a lot of other people at his time, was best if it was sort of layered. You know, leaders had managers under them who were making sure that I's got dotted, T's got crossed, and then they had leaders who were inspiring troops and managers who were making sure the troops showed up for work, and so on and so forth. And so I think that one of the things that I know that one of the things that worried David, beyond just sort of the destruction of the whole newspaper advertising paradigm and things like that, was the weakening in the traditional media of the gatekeeper's role. To me, and I think to David, it's truly horrifying to contemplate that the New York Times does not have a copy desk. I mean, think about what can slip through in that kind of a situation. And I think because David, as John Fleischaker and Kim Green were pointing out, certainly had a tendency to push the envelope, he appreciated the role of gatekeepers because they kept him out of trouble, they kept his newspaper out of trouble, they kept every one of us who's practiced the craft out of trouble. And I think that's something that he, like a lot of us, would find very worrisome and would hope that there's going to be some sort of mid-course correction at some point and restore more of that role, both in traditional and non-traditional media.
And of course, newspapers don't have much of a copy desk anymore because the demand is to get copy out, be first, get the clicks, get the sticky eyeballs, and that is the technology that's being driven. John Fleischaker.
David and I used to talk about this all the time. I think we agreed, which is why we talked about it all the time. I truly do not believe there's any such thing as totally objective journalism. I'm not a journalist, but I have sat through hundreds of discussions about stories and editorials. It all starts with what stories do you go after, who do you talk to, whom do you talk with, what do you leave in, what do you leave out. It is foolishness to talk about objectivity in the sense of that. I also really, really despise the need to get the other side of the opinion, other side of the case, when it is pure hogwash. I always use the example of the Holocaust deniers. There is no reason to go talk to a Holocaust denier when you're talking about the Holocaust. There simply is no reason. I think we have numerous examples of that today. I do not think, Al, that there is a conflict between fact reporting and opinion. I think there is a difficulty in making sure that the opinion is based on real facts. And I'm not quite sure how you do that, except by responding to it and talking about it. But I think it's I think in simply to frame it in terms of objectivity versus opinion is a false statement, because the lack of objectivity doesn't mean the lack of facts.
No, objectivity is not the goal. It's not supposed to be the product. It's the method. You test every piece of information that comes before you, and some information is not worthy of consideration.
No, I think you test facts, for sure. And I think we live in an age when we can ruminate all we want about the fact that it's changed, but it has changed, and we have to deal with it and figure out how we're going to deal with it. But I think, and I've said this to numerous journalism students that I've talked with, that it is important that you not forget yourself when you're writing a story, that you not forget where you came from when you're writing an editorial. That's what it's all about, it seems to me. So that's my view.
Do you think that our audiences have difficulty differentiating between fact and opinion? And do you think that information outlets do a bad job of differentiating it themselves?
Yes and yes.
Okay. Question, and do we have a microphone? Yes. Well, we're on YouTube, so please wait for the microphone.
Morgan, this is coming at you.
Betty has somebody has a quick note here.
Oh, it's okay.
All right. Let's go to the aisle.
So Morgan, being the youngest on that dais up there, you're going to be faced the most with a lack of a strong Courier Journal, a strong, everything that's been said in the last few minutes, looking in the rearview mirror. Looking out through the front, what what does this mean to your career, and what do you think could be developed or happen that would bring this more into a better situation than what you're faced with today?
Tell them you're a journalism graduate.
Thank you for the easy question, Charles. I mentioned I traveled with Dave, and we talked every day when we weren't going to Frankfurt together. I've heard a lot about his experience with journalism. I also, for what it's worth, and as a lawyer and now politician, apparently not much. I do have a journalism degree from the University of Missouri School of Journalism, so experienced some of the stuff that goes on in the journalism world as well. I see the lack of a strong press corps as a crisis going forward. Thanks. Yeah. But I really do. And I say that even from someone who is very passionate and very much I have a viewpoint of how I want government to operate, and a strong viewpoint. We still need the press to even hold us accountable. And when you look at what's happening in Frankfurt right now, one of the things that David would talk about when sometimes we'd be getting salty about what was going on in Frankfurt, he said, when I saw the General Assembly as being in session, I viewed that as one of the most important events in Kentucky. Because say what you want to about the Kentucky General Assembly, we're not a do-nothing legislature. And oftentimes when the General Assembly was in session, he would have, how many people were in the Frankfurt Bureau, Al?
There were 5 when I left it, and at times during legislative sessions we would have 10 plus photographers.
Yeah, so I mean, David would say there would be 10 to 15 people from the Courier on any given day in Frankfurt covering what was going on in the General Assembly. We're lucky to have 1 or 2 now up there actually full time. And they cannot provide the coverage. They can't do the job. They can't get the stories that are going on behind what you see on the floor. And then, of course, you talk about bias. I was thinking about the conversation of bias. Bias exists everywhere. Bias exists in what is merely on the front page of a paper and what a paper views as the most important story going on. And as we're surfing and shopping for clicks right now, as people aren't getting a physical paper and you don't have the resources, it's hard to make people care about what we're doing in Frankfurt because it's hard to let people know what's going on in Frankfurt. I think you take that now away from Frankfurt and apply it to the Metro Council. Apply it to what's going on in our neighborhoods. Apply it to the Louisville Metro Police Department. Apply it to so many different agencies in Kentucky that we don't have the ability with a press corps to adequately cover now. I view that as a real problem going forward, and particularly as we shift to more opinion-driven and affirming news.
Do you think reporters are too reliant on watching the Zoom meetings online instead of coming to the meetings?
I do, and I don't mean to just dog reporters here. That's not my job. I've always actually had an affinity for reporters, as cynical and difficult as they can be sometimes. But I think they're doing that, Al, because of time constraints.
Yeah.
And so look, if you just want a little report of what happened in committee with no context, that's not going to get people interested in what's going on and the relationships and the politics and the reasons behind what's going on. We just got out of a 3-day special session with drastic consequences to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And I did not see any adequate reporting on why it happened and why the things happened the way they did.
Yeah, there was no real reporting about what the governor had offered to them and how they rejected it. I talked to you briefly for Kentucky Health News, and I didn't see anybody else write about it. Betty?
I was going to say maybe in the golden age of journalism when I came in, which really wasn't the golden age, there was problems, but I can just remember relentlessly covering school board meetings and just the smallest meeting. And at the Courier-Journal, when it was election time, we interviewed all the candidates. And I mean, it's one thing for us to focus on what Joe Biden is doing, but it's another thing when you don't know what your Metro Council is doing, what the city council is doing. And it seems to me, and my condolences to a lot of the young journalists who do not have those evil editors to be in your face and to say, you need to ask another question. You need to go back out and do it again. They're working harder than ever with fewer resources. And then and it's this pretense. It's like, I don't understand why I can hear the weather 3 times in a 22-minute newscast and not a word about what Mitch McConnell is doing, what Rand Paul is doing. And it was so tedious the way we would put out that voter's guide, for example. And people hated the Courier-Journal, but at least they had the guide so they could vote against everybody who we said. But at least they had information. And I just feel for the young people who are entering the business now. And some of you may know, when I was in Columbia in grad school, Norman Isaacs, who had been at the Courier as an executive editor, that's how I knew about it. I wrote what I thought was a wonderful story. And Norman was my teacher. And Norman read the first 3 paragraphs and he said, "Baye, what is this shit?" And I'm saying that what a lot of the younger journalists are not having to get in this time is an editor that says, "What is this shit?" Well, you got to talk to one more person, and you need, and I just feel for them because they're trying harder, and
They're hungry for content, not substance, right?
yeah, and so many of them now want to be entertainment reporters because for them all journalism is entertainment. They all want to be, covering celebrities and stuff like that, and it's really kind of sad. But I think David Hawpe, I try to think about David Hawpe covering George Floyd, covering Breonna Taylor, and I think the Courier did a marvelous job. They did a whole lot this summer with a little.
Pulitzer finalist.
Yeah, but the thing is that I just think about what David was there, and we'd have been crawling all over and staying up all night in the newsroom and stuff like that.
We have a question or comment from John Nelson.
Yeah, I think that everyone here would agree that David was had strong journalism ethics, and in 1994 he championed an effort that upset a good number of his colleagues across the state, some of them sitting at this table, when he proposed a news council. And he even got the legislature to introduce a bill that would subsidize a news council right here at the University of Kentucky to the tune of $1 million to be matched by a foundation. It failed because it didn't have the support of his colleagues in the industry. But I wonder, looking back, if anybody thinks that had that effort succeeded here or even across the country to improve the image of the media, would we be in a different place?
Yeah, not just the image, but the performance, you mean, right?
The council was supposed to, as I recall, create a study of journalism ethics here at the university, and then it would allow readers who had complaints against individual newspapers, if they would give up their right to sue, to come and have their case heard and judged with no other consequences.
Anybody on the panel want to talk about it? John?
Do I have this on? I do have it on. That was one issue that David and I totally disagreed on. And I was, I think, pretty vocal about it. I always thought that a code of ethics for newspapers and newspaper reporters should be do the best you can do. Tell the truth as you know it and do the best you can do. Very short. I think, in fact, I'm comfortable that I'm right. I'm sometimes wrong, as Kim will tell you, but I'm never uncomfortable with that. That when the state starts in getting itself involved with judging content, that is the wrong road to go down. It is a serious, serious problem. I am against long codes of ethics because I am a true believer I don't know how this sounds, but I'm a real believer in situational ethics when it comes to reporting, that you might do something if you're covering Watergate that you're not going to do if you're covering an automobile accident. That it's not a black and white issue, if you will. And I think that it would have been a terrible mistake because it would have been used not in that particular lawsuit. It would have, you may have avoided a lawsuit, but it would come back to haunt you in the next lawsuit.
Get held to a certain standard, you mean?
It's a standard.
Yeah.
You have people other than editors and newspaper publishers creating a standard for what you're going to do. That is, to me, totally in opposite to what the whole First Amendment is all about.
We've reached 4 o'clock, but if there's the pain of an unexpressed thought or question in the audience, we'll be happy to entertain it. Or maybe you're hungry. Maybe some of you from Louisville didn't get lunch. Well, let me thank you for attending. Someone said before we got started that they really missed him. And I said, well, after this is all over, we'll miss him even more. But tribute must be paid. This was a life well lived. So here's to David Hawpe. Thank you for coming. The reception is